I guess they keep asking the same questions over and over. Okay, things just to mention to you. Thing number one, if you get a 1 on a weekly question, that means I can't read it. I can't open it. There's something wrong with how, I'm not trying to be judgmental at all. I did a professional development session yesterday and said something that offended somebody, and they put in the private chat how rude I was. It's like, yeah, sorry. So not trying to say you're wrong or you're not very smart or anything. I'm just saying technology is a thing, and I can't open what you submitted if you got a 1. So I'm not being really rude to you. I probably would rarely give you a 1 out of 10 on your work unless it was just really, like I ask you, say, compare and contrast new nationalism, and you said the sky is blue. I might give you a 1 just because I was entertained. But the reason I'm giving you a 1 is because, sorry, I left my phone on, is because I can't open your document. So resubmit it in some other form, paste it in, I do whatever you can, okay? So if you got a 1, I wasn't trying to be rude, I just can't read it. And in the chat, or not the chat section, the comment section of the rubric or the feedback section, I'll write in there, I was unable to open your submission, something like that. So if you read the comment section, and I get too that you may not be able to open it, I got it. I know all the technology is weird, but if you get a 1, that's why. Also, it is not my goal to have you redo quizzes when you got low grades on them. Now, I think we've talked about this before. There's lots of points available in this class, so if you lose 2 points or 5 points, there's a really good chance you can gain them back some other way. So I would rather you were focused on the current assignments, making sure you do those really well. And if we're at the end of the class and you were 2 points from a certain grade point, we'll talk then, okay? I promise. I'm not going to leave you hanging because you're a point or 2 away from a little grade level. And well, there are always exceptions. Like if I get the impression you cheated on stuff or you never attended class. I mean, there's some caveats there, like, some of those folks that we've never seen in class. Probably not too much slack for them, but if you're here and you stay in touch and you're turning stuff in regularly, a point or 2 difference is we'll work on that. So try to have a little, I know we don't know each other, but just have a little confidence that I'll be as fair as I can with you. And I really just don't want to go back and redo and regrade stuff 100 times because I'm barely keeping up, with the stuff that you guys are doing with, 300 or 400 submissions each time your stuff's due. Also, the next quiz, hopefully, will go live tomorrow at midnight. So Friday, 12:01, I think is how I have it programmed. That does not mean you should stay up till, unless you're already up because your kid's keeping you up or something. Feel free. So hopefully it goes live to Wednesday, 12:01. Or I guess that's Thursday, 12:01, and should stay live until 11:59 on Friday. If for some reason you can't fit it in during those time periods, then you need to email me and we'll figure some stuff out. But that should give you those 2 or 3 days. This one has 20 questions rather than 8 or 10 like the first one. So, and then I'll send a survey after that to see if you like that better or worse. Of course, the worst part is there's more questions. The better part is they're only worth 2 points each. So you, after you take that one, I'll send one more survey and see what you think. I will tell you it takes a longer time to write, of course, but I think I also figured out how to transfer the quiz from one section to another so I don't have to retype it every time, which is cool. All right. Blackboard. It's a mystery to me. Okay. Question. Yeah, I know when they're worth 5 points, it's harder. I'm sorry about that. I really do think, because we've built in the extra credit of the book review, and I think it's going to be okay. But I understand how distressing it is too. I'm not trying to minimize that either. Okay. So we need to talk about Great Depression. The question for this week is identify changes, ouch, 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 in American philosophy and society brought by the New Deal. Mention specific laws, philosophies, or politicians in this discussion. So we'll talk a little bit about the New Deal, and then we'll pause a little ways through to talk a little more specifically about the question. All right, sharing the screen. It's going to be my goal today not to offend anyone. I was so surprised I offended someone yesterday. It's never my goal, but I'm always entertained when it happens. I shouldn't be entertained. I don't mean, that sounded bad, didn't it? But like I have one person in my life that also hates me, which I think is so funny because I think I'm just so nondescript. It's like, I can see why you'd be annoyed by me. I could see why you'd be distracted, but hating's just so strong. I don't know, there are very few people I've ever even come close to hating. It takes so much energy. And then I try really hard not to offend people, but I was really successful yesterday. So, okay, not that that's good, but again, entertaining for me. You know who was offended in the 1930s? Everyone, because there was a Great Depression. And it's, when you're broke, you're cranky. Yeah, you've been broke before. Some of you are broke right now. I've been broke. I could be sort of, I don't know if I'm broke now, but not college broke. College broke. That was rough. Okay. So the economy's collapsed. There are no jobs to be had. And you have a president in 31 and 32 before the election who's saying prosperity is just around the corner. The economy will fix itself. Doesn't want to do too much stuff with the government to help out the average person because they don't want the average person to become lazy and dependent on the government, which isn't out of the mainstream at the beginning of the Great Depression, but crud, by 32, people were just broke and tired and hungry and needed help. I was like, who can help us? And everybody was too broke to help each other, except for like the 5 guys that had money who weren't being very generous at the time period. So what you see with the New Deal, which is a fairly important thing, and it's part of why you have the question you have this week, is a change in philosophy about what the government's role is in society. And this is a discussion that we're constantly having. Maybe not you and I or you and your family, although possibly. But as a society, what is the purpose of the government and what are they supposed to fix and what are they supposed to stay out of? For most of our history, they were mostly supposed to stay out of stuff. Occasionally they would intervene, like when half of the country decided we don't want to be part of the country anymore. Whether you think that was a good decision or not, that was a decision the federal government made. Occasionally, they would enforce the borders. And sometimes we would go to war overseas to intervene in other people's business, but even that was pretty rare. So mostly the government stayed out of stuff. And this is an era where that will start to change because the crisis is big. And because it's really hard to see that anyone else can fix this, and they don't think it's going to fix itself quickly enough to avoid a devastating effect. So there you go. All right. So details. So 20s roaring for some, for sure, but the 30s not roaring for very many people. If you're wondering, like, did anybody do well? There were a handful of people that saw that the stock market was going to collapse. So they sold early and then they kept their proceeds. And then when all the stocks crashed, they went back and bought really cheap stocks. Now it's going to take a long time for them to recover, 6 or 8 years. But when they do recover, they're going to recover in an extraordinary way. So there'll be people who become millionaires because of the stock market crash, but that is really a handful of people. Very few economists thought that the stock market would crash the way it did. There's always an expectation, at least in the modern era, that there might be adjustments, that sort of thing. But it's pretty rare for somebody to foresee a crash. And in my lifetime, disclaimer, I'm old, but I wasn't alive in the 1930s or 29 when the stock market crashed. Neither were my parents, by the way, born in 41. But I do remember a stock market crash, the dot-com collapse. And I don't, some of you might be old enough to remember that as children. I had just graduated from college. This is late 80s, early 90s, and was trying to find a job. And even in the teaching field, which, you know, is not terribly dependent on the economy, it's a little, but I was unable to find a teaching job that was adequate. So I worked at Target, which is lovely, by the way. Target's very nice. But was not exactly what I had studied to do. And then I found a very exciting teaching job where someone tried to stab me. So that wasn't ideal either. So in the 30s, you couldn't even find the job at Target or the teaching job where someone might try to stab you, which my guess is was not as common in the 1930s. Honestly, not as common now either. Very rare occasion. So I like to share the story because very few people have that story. To fix the economy, what the heck are we going to do? Herbert Hoover, who had been highly esteemed before this time period, thought that the way to fix the economy was to let it fix itself. There's a very traditional conservative economic idea or economic theory. And it's what most people believed because the economy had always fixed itself. There were a handful of people who believed in another economic theory that there had to be government intervention to fix an economy. Now, in the little stock market crash that I was talking about, the dot-com thing, which was a little more of a collapse of a certain sector of the economy, it did eventually recover, but it was slow. And if some of your parents lived in the Austin area and worked in some of those online businesses, they probably had to switch jobs. They probably did. And then, of course, we'll have a housing collapse in the economy about 8 or 10 years later, which had some ripple effects too. So I think in the modern era, we're used to parts of the economy struggling. We're not used to the entire economy collapsing. And, you know, even in the present time, clearly we're in an economic difficulty. I know it's not our biggest problem, but it's certainly a side effect of our biggest problem right now, where some people's jobs have really disappeared, especially if you work in the restaurant industry and you're not doing takeout or delivery. So that sector and bars and things like that, if you work as a waiter or as wait staff, and we're dependent on tips, oh my goodness, because you can't do that from home. Whereas other industries were able to adapt. Usually the economy is able to adapt. But in this era, there's nothing to adapt to. There's just no money. Yeah, the tech sector, you are not kidding, except clearly for me. The use of some of the tech sector is a little rough for me, but it's also, you know, I have friends in other occupations, and even this one, who have said, you know, when this is over, there's probably going to be a lot more working from home than we understood, and people will downsize their offices because they're realizing some of it's really not necessary. Now, of course, there are other jobs that, yeah, you have to physically go to work. So, all right, but in the 30s, there's just no jobs. Yeah, that's the problem. No jobs at all. Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Somebody can work and not go to work. I guess I've been the same though, haven't I? Only I'm probably not as successful at the tech part. All right, so the economic theory that the government needs to intervene is called Keynesian economics, and we'll talk about it's coming, and I'll highlight it so you can see it here in a sec. All right, so the 30s, oh my goodness. 30s are a rough decade because we start out broke and we end up starting to get involved in a world war. So you start out, the whole world's broke, and then you get Hitler, and then you get Mussolini, and then you get Stalin, who I know is Soviet Union's part of the solution, but then part of the problem. I'm sure they'd be thrilled I said that, but they don't exist anymore, so I can't offend them the way I offended people yesterday. All right, so back to the 20s, Herbert Hoover and Al Smith ran, oh my goodness. Did you see, I don't know if you guys watch political stuff on television. There were people at the Al Smith dinner, which they have annually. Al Smith was the mayor of New York City, and his parents were immigrants, I think from Ireland. Oh, so sorry. And he was Catholic, and he was just kind of a little bit of a rowdy New York City kind of dude. So they have an annual Al Smith dinner, which really raises money for Catholic charities. Thank you. Excuse me. And it typically is used to highlight any sort of anti-Catholic bias, which of course is a little bit in the news right now because of the Supreme Court justice who's being confirmed, and then at her more, I guess, distant confirmation, people talked about her religious views, which, you know, I realize is probably just a person or two who mentioned it, and but it's you know, it helps raise funds and bring awareness, and you know, you use what you can. And I don't think being, you know, a Catholic anything, because, you know, they also talked about Joe Biden was a speaker at the Al Smith dinner. So you've got Catholic politicians on either side, and Amy Coney Barrett's not a politician, but, you know, she's not going to be the first Catholic justice ever. We've certainly, one of the guys that passed recently, Antonin Scalia, was Catholic. So. But Al Smith was really looked down upon in this era because he was Catholic. And he was seen as kind of rough. We'll just go with that. So when Herbert Hoover and Al Smith ran against each other, Al Smith was kind of the big city Catholic who maybe you couldn't trust and seemed a little seedy and probably violated prohibition when you weren't looking. And Herbert Hoover was where did he go to? Stanford, yeah. Stanford graduate who grew up on a farm and went from poor to wealthy and was very charitable. So Herbert Hoover's kind of your polished candidate, and Al Smith's a little bit more of your rough candidate. Plus he's Catholic, which we don't trust during that time period. So, because, you know, it's just a sign that you're close to your immigrant roots and you're just not the right kind of Christian, which was sort of a thing back during this time period. I really don't think it's a factor in the modern era very often. However, some people are currently suggesting it is. Okay, so Hoover is very American. He is kind of the farm boy who's done well for himself, small town guy who's been successful, been Secretary of Commerce, really in part responsible for the prosperity of the 20s. So we like him. So he wins by quite a bit. But it does also reveal the split in the Democrats and the Republicans, where, at least in the Midwest, the Republicans get the rural vote, rural, I have a hard time saying that word, the country vote, and Democrats get the urban vote, the city vote. And in the South, Black folks aren't voting, so white guys vote for Democrats. But the population in the South is still really small, and they don't have as many cities. So when we talk about the urban vote, we really are talking about northeastern cities. New York, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, those cities. Yep. Okay. So parties portrayed, typo. Smith is pro-alien. He liked foreigners too much. So Smith does well in cities with lots of immigrants. Hoover wins by a lot. But then, you know, the stock market crashes, and then we're going to blame Hoover and the Republicans for the Great Depression and not elect Republicans for a long time. I don't know if you want to blame Hoover for the stock market crash. Feel free. I mean, it's up to you. It's a really complex problem, which he clearly was a part of as Secretary of Commerce through the whole 20s. But, you know, he didn't make the legislation. He wasn't the president. So he's a part of that system and certainly supported that system in a really important way. But it's a system that the majority of people agreed with. People thought, well, this is going well. Let's keep it going.
Actually, a question real quick.
Go ahead.
If I was understanding the textbook correct the other day, reading about Herbert Hoover,
Uh-huh.
wasn't he fairly understood to be a real smart guy who just kind of succeeded at everything he did?
Yes,
Okay, that was him. I was just making sure I wasn't mixing him up.
absolutely.
So in that manner, could you say that he wasn't really prepared for everything to fall out from under him, and
That's, there's probably some truth to that
he,
because,
he
yeah,
yeah, he just wanted everything and did everything right, and then
yeah,
suddenly nothing was right and everything was broken and everything was his fault.
yeah, yeah. On a much smaller scale, it might be like, you always getting A's until your first college class and you get your first B or C and you go like, oh my gosh, how'd that happen? Yeah, Herbert Hoover, you're right, he just had the golden touch. I mean, just everything he did went well. He was in charge of the food relief during World War One. I mean, he's super charitable. He became a multimillionaire in his 20s, which most of us do. Um, he developed some gold mining technique and patented it. So he's just a fabulously successful engineer. And then once he becomes a millionaire, really dedicates himself to public service. He's a super admirable guy, really intelligent fellow, really good at making money. So I think he's in so many ways the American dream. Also marries this college sweetheart. I mean, he's a good guy as well. So I think you're probably right. He wasn't prepared for this level of failure, but truthfully, I mean, who would be, except maybe FDR? And we'll talk about what in FDR's background may have prepared him, which probably wasn't academic or economic, although he was a smart guy as well, but didn't have to succeed. Is that a fair thing to say? In the same way Hoover did, because he started off wealthy. Hoover started off, moderate income, poor-ish. So, but yeah, nice point about Hoover. It's true. So stock market crashes because of all kinds of stuff: international issues, land speculation, overproduction. Land speculations where people are buying essentially overpriced land and then reselling it. People did the same thing with stocks: overproduction, underconsumption, agricultural recession, plus all of the things we talked about before with unregulated stock market. So that decade of lack of regulation, laissez-faire capitalism, definitely going to fall apart. Okay, so stock market crashes will take the entire decade for it to recover. So in 32, after Hoover keeps promising that the economy will fix itself, um, soon there'll be a chicken in every pot, says we just have to kind of keep sacrificing, that companies need to just not fire people. Plus, he does do some stuff. We talked about this last time. He creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Federal Farm Bureau, to try to help larger businesses with kind of the early version of the trickle-down economic theory, that if you help the job creators, that they will use that money to continue to help their employees, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. In this instance, probably didn't. Some of you may argue later in the 1980s that it does. So we'll get a chance to have that argument later. There's nobody that's going to argue that this worked in the 30s because there's no evidence. There's no part of the economy that recovers. There are also going to be, I'll tell you this up front, there are going to be people who say that not only did what Hoover did, Hoover's programs didn't work, neither did FDR's. FDR's programs don't end the Great Depression. And there's some truth to that as well, because the Great Depression really is ended by production for World War II, which stimulates the economy. Now, most people would argue that FDR's programs helped during the Great Depression. But the big argument between the two economic factions, there's probably at least two economic factions, is did the conservative use of economics that Herbert Hoover employed, would that have led to a recovery anyway, without the amount of debt that was created by the New Deal? Or did the New Deal fail because it refused to spend as much money as it needed to create enough debt, which is an uncomfortable idea, to create debt, although there are probably times where debt is necessary. say, who's the guy that talks about economics that says you like personal economics? It's like a religious guy. I don't know, who says you should never go into debt. But anyway, on the big scale, if your economy is suffering, the Keynesian economic theory is that the only way to end a depression of that magnitude is to spend your way out of that depression. And of course, you can't do that individually. Please don't try. It's not good for you, not good for your credit. Yeah, your family will get upset with you. But as a country, the country can create new, they can print money, or they can take on debt that is as high as their I guess in the modern era, they say it's okay to take on debt that is equal to 1 year of the gross domestic product, what your country produces in a year, and that's still manageable. Most of us in our personal lives, unless, well, when you buy a house, maybe. But other than that, I'm probably not going to do that, okay? Yeah, this is also when we are going to divert from the gold standard, and then we kind of go back and forth later on, but we're officially out of the gold standard at this point. Yes. All right, because we're going to essentially print a bunch of money, and we don't have enough specie, gold or silver, to back that up. So, sorry, back to business here. So, FDR is going to promise that we're just going to keep trying stuff. We're not going to stick with just the RFC and the Federal Farm Bureau and occasionally build a very large and nice dam. We're going to have more public works projects. We're going to try all sorts of different programs. And if they work, we keep them. If they don't work, throw them away and try again. And he'll refer to his program as the New Deal. Now, the New Deal has very few specifics when he's promising it. It's just pretty much what I said. We're going to keep trying stuff till we find stuff that works. Honestly, as bad as the economy is, and as much as people admired Herbert Hoover personally and thought he was a smart guy and a good guy, doesn't mean we need to keep him as president. I think you'll see something similar, but not for the same reasons. Well, similar reasons, with Jimmy Carter, who I am just sure is one of the most revered ex-presidents we have ever had, because he's just a lovely person. There's just no way around it. And I'm not trying to make a way around it. I really like Jimmy Carter. However, what you'll notice when he's president is things don't go well. So kind of the same with Herbert Hoover. Great guy, rough presidency. So FDR, in that promise to do whatever it takes, I think part of the reason that he has this philosophy, and this isn't as well known as you might expect during the time period, is because he'd recovered from polio as much as he could. Polio is a pretty rough disease. We don't have it so much here anymore because of vaccinations, immunizations. I'm trying to think, when you get the polio vaccine, I think it's part of the HPV maybe. No, the P is pertussis. It's a separate vaccine. Seems like when we got it, it was an oral vaccine, but I'm old. My dad actually had polio, and polio was really common up through the 1950s. My dad got it probably in 42. Shared often by mosquitoes. That's typically how people got it, from one person to another. And it paralyzes you. And then as the paralysis retreats, sometimes you get back certain functions, sometimes you don't. And typically the paralysis goes all the way to your lungs, at least briefly. So you're going to have assistance breathing. And some people had to live in what they called an iron lung, a machine that helped them breathe for their entire lives. For my dad, he was fortunate in a lot of ways. He certainly considers himself fortunate. He was able to walk without the use of crutches or braces, but he has one leg that really the muscles never developed, and one foot is much smaller than the other, and he has a limp, which he works very hard for you not to notice. FDR's paralysis left him unable to use his legs. So he was unable to walk. He used crutches and braces or a wheelchair. And because it's a weird a weird time. How academic of an analysis is that? Because in the era that FDR lived, people saw physical difference or disability as a weakness. It was not popularly known that FDR was unable to walk. Now, I'm not saying it's a complete secret, but the press agreed to make sure not to publish photos of FDR where he was being assisted in walking, where his braces were obvious, or where he was in his wheelchair, because they thought that would project weakness. Now, you know, in the modern era, we tend to look at people who've overcome some of those struggles and say, like, man, that's impressive. But during this era, people seem to think, at least at the level where those decisions were made, that if people knew we had a president who was unable to walk on his own, that would make the country look weak. So FDR hid from the public that he couldn't walk. Now, people knew that he'd had polio. He had run for vice president in 1920, right before he got polio, and had served as, I think he was governor of New York, just like his uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, and had been in the Navy as well, which is a very Rooseveltian tradition. His son and then Teddy Roosevelt Jr. will be in the Navy. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. and FDR's son also will fight in World War II. And the Roosevelt family, I trust that you remember this, very wealthy patrician family, daughters of the American Revolution kind of group, all the, you know, can trace their lineage all the way back to the founding of the country. Very wealthy Dutch immigrants who maintain that wealth over generations and still possess it. So they tend to be Harvard educated folks. Their lives are not difficult financially, but, you know, of course, had other struggles as well. So I think because FDR had to have that grit to overcome the difficulties of polio, and had probably had to try several different sorts of things, I think maybe his mindset was a little more open to trying non-traditional things. We'll go with that. And also, I think because he had worked through some extreme difficulties before, and I'm not saying that Hoover hadn't, but I think FDR had to work through a different sort of difficulty. I don't know. But FDR really projected a lot of optimism, and that people just really kind of latched onto that. And people who talk about him as a politician say that he had the common touch. And in a weird way, I'm definitely not comparing FDR to Trump at all. But Trump is a fairly well-off guy. I mean, he has more money than the average person. And he's been fairly successful and definitely does not live a lifestyle that's similar to mine or yours, I would guess. I don't know your lifestyle, but I'm going to guess that, you know, since we're all here, that it's probably not the same. However, I think the people who like Trump the most are people that probably don't share a lot in his background, because for whatever reason, he's really relatable to those folks. And it's not because he's the same. He just, for whatever reason, shares a common touch with them. Like, I know I told you I was talking to my very favorite aunt back in the Ozarks, and the biggest Trump supporter I know is it's my cousin's husband, who's an entrepreneur and very successful in his own right, certainly makes more money than I do. Started off by hauling trash and emptying porta potties, which can't be good. However, you can make a lot of money doing stuff that no one else wants to do. And at his business, he flies the Trump flag and will argue with you all day about how Trump is the greatest president we've ever had. And he feels like he has a lot in common with Trump. And I think in the entrepreneurial way, he probably does. Other than that, I mean, I've seen the trailer where this guy grew up. So, you know, I know in the background he doesn't. But FDR and Trump is why I was using the analogy, but FDR had this ability to relate to people that didn't have the same background that he did. And that's a key to success in politics. I think it's part of why I could never be a politician. Yeah, but anyway. All right, so FDR, who comes from a privileged background, but really is relatable, is going to have a very successful campaign. And in part because he projects this optimism, and he's going to say the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, with a really nice kind of Northeastern accent. So, yeah, very nice. I should find a video of that for you. All right. I put in a chart because I got excited because I could insert a chart of some New Deal agencies that might be useful. I think next time in class, I'll double check on them. Oh, crud, but some of you are going to take that quiz before. So let me peek really quick. Give you a hint. Now, if I open this, will you tell me if what I cried? I'm afraid that no, hang on, sorry. I'm just going to stop sharing because I just don't want to accidentally post the quiz and you all see it. I know you wouldn't mind as much, but I figure maybe I'll give you a little heads up on which New Deal agencies you should probably look at for the quiz. And then you can include them in your answer if you want to as well. So it'd be like 2 for 2. All right. CCC, NRA, AAA. Those things make the quiz. Okay. I know some of you are going like, what'd she say? Hang on a sec, and then I'll type it in the chat. Oh, I lost you. Where are your faces? There they are. Okay, chat. Yeah. So let me type. CCC, AAA, and NRA for the quiz. Okay. Or the whiz. I really am not typing well. I never do. All right. So if you look at those things for the quiz, that will help you. And then if you want, you can use some of those in your, oops, there's the quiz again. Lecture notes, there we go. Okay. You can use some of those in your answer if you like to the weekly question. But since I said those 3, we'll look over them. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, easily the most popular, well, I don't know. I think it was the most popular program of the time period. I think there are a few that we like more historically because they're still around, but this mostly took urban dudes who were wandering around causing trouble, as urban unemployed dudes might do, and gave them jobs in national parks and forests where they planted trees, built bridges, set up park ranger stations, made roads, that sort of thing. I hear a helicopter right above my house. Flood control projects, that sort of thing. And the reason it was popular is because of the population that it assisted, who probably were up to no good because they didn't have anything to do and were frustrated. But this gave them something really positive to do. And even if you thought that it wasn't the government's place to create jobs, because certainly there were people with that philosophy, you still liked the end effect of this. So, you know, it's like, I don't know, this is a great analogy, but I'm still going to make it. Even if you're not a huge fan of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, you probably do like that it makes that it makes sure that insurance companies can't reject you for pre-existing conditions. Sorry that I couldn't get that out. Or, you know, because I'm old, I don't necessarily get this, but a lot of parents are excited because they can keep their kids on their insurance until they're 26. I'm old, so when I was a kid, it's like when you're 18, you got to start paying for your own stuff. Did any of you have those parents? No. From the Ozarks, man. You know, you start having kids at 14, you better be paying for yourself at 18, right? All right, so the CCC was incredibly popular. It was, and it gave people, you know, it gave people something productive to do, even if you weren't sure that you agreed with that philosophically. Oh, and I need to go back and talk about Keynesian economic theories for a sec. So I know that I mentioned this before, but John Maynard Keynes was a British, that's all I had to say, was was a British economist. There's a word I need to put in there. A British economist who developed the theory that the only way to get out of a depression, a major depression, in the modern era, was for the federal government, the national government, to spend its way out. And that planned deficits were okay. Up until this point, as a rule, countries did not go into debt. If they did go into debt, it was very much a temporary situation, usually during a war. And then they would pay their way out of that, as soon as the war was over. And that's certainly, for most of our history in the United States, we were not a debtor nation. We did not stay in debt. And that was true of most nations, because typically if you went into debt, your country collapsed. In the modern era, you can look around, there are very few countries that don't carry a national debt. Now, some of them carry one that's super excessive, like Greece or Venezuela. But, there are some like ours that carry what looks to be massive, but sometimes still continues on. And I asked my friends who are better about economics, like, how can we have a national debt that's equal to our, annual gross domestic product, and we're okay? And they explained that to me in a way that makes me feel slightly better. But I think because we relate it to our own economic situations, doesn't work as well. During this era, nobody thought you should carry debt. So this idea that it was okay to have a planned deficit made people nervous. Now, FDR is going to embrace that for a while. And then you'll notice too, as you read through the chapter in 1937, he goes, "Oh crap, that's a lot of debt," the direct quote. And so he is going to scale back some of these programs, which will lead our economy into a recession, which they'll refer to as the Roosevelt recession. So, when they name stuff after you, it's not always good, especially if it's a recession. Okay, so back to the programs. I think, again, you could talk about any of these if you wanted for your weekly question, but the ones that are on the quiz are the ones I put in the chat. So CCC, and then I think the AAA, at least for our purposes, and the NRA do similar things, but in different sectors or segments of the economy. So AAA is, Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what it does is essentially creates a minimum wage for farmers. So farmers had honestly been overproducing. They were still producing at rates that probably would have been okay if there were an international conflict and we needed to feed more people in our country. But we're just really good at making food here. We are. So we grow a lot of stuff and raise a lot of stuff. And farm prices were really depressed. People were not making, the price of food was really low. Now, I get it, people were broke and still couldn't afford it, but the price of food was really low. The farmers weren't making enough money to cover their costs. The obvious solution is to grow less stuff or raise fewer, less livestock or fewer animals. But that's not our natural tendency. If we are not making enough money and we sell stuff, our thought is, well, we'll just make more stuff and sell it, which further depresses the price. So the AAA sets production limits and tells farmers, this is how much you can grow. And the first year of the AAA, they plowed undercrops and destroyed livestock and dumped out milk. That looked really, really bad in the press. And it was really kind of looked down upon at first. But eventually what it does is stabilize the farm sector. And it will create a series of loans that are available to farmers where the federal government will buy extra crops, things that they had overproduced, and they will store those crops for them, or honestly, what typically happened is give those away as commodities, give food to poor people. Now that's going to take a couple of years for that whole program to get, I guess, worked out. I can't think of the right word, but to where it's administered properly. So in the first year, they're paying people to plow crops under and to destroy livestock and milk. And it looks really bad. But the problem never was that we didn't have enough food. The problem was people couldn't afford to buy food, and we didn't have a good distribution plan to get food to people. So the AAA will help with that. The NRA is going to set production limits and wage codes and also minimum wage and maximum working hours for industrial jobs. So they do pretty much the same thing, one for agriculture, one for business. Both of these programs tend to help large businesses more than small businesses because it's going to end up raising wages for small businesses to the point where a lot of them couldn't afford to pay. Union workers will sometimes complain, and rightfully so, that the NRA actually reduced some of their wages in larger shops. So it might have allowed Ford Motor Company to pay people less. So some workers are going to be hurt by the NRA, some workers will be helped. Larger businesses tend to be helped, smaller businesses tend to be hurt. Now, the reason that both of these are on the quiz and kind of memorable historically is because both of them are declared to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So you'll definitely want to remember that. Just my little hint for you. Part of the reason they're both declared unconstitutional, not the same case, but in the same year, I think it was, is because the Supreme Court, still fairly conservative during that era, thinks that this gives the government too much power over private industry, that it gives them powers that only Congress should potentially have because the federal government administered these programs. And it, in some cases, like there was something called the Schenkter versus New York, which was the sick chicken case, which is part of the case that declares the AAA unconstitutional. There are laws regulating, it gives the states the ability to send in poultry inspectors to make sure that the chickens are okay for sale. And what these inspectors did sometimes they were, legitimately inspecting. Sometimes they're just counting, like, no, there's too many chickens, so, we're not going to sell these. We're going to donate these, or we're going to destroy these, and the others will slaughter and then put for sale. Because that happened within the state of New York and didn't deal with interstate commerce, then the Supreme Court said that the federal government doesn't have the right to administer programs that are only essentially at the state level. So they don't have the authority to do that. So in general, these two laws, AAA and NRA, are declared unconstitutional because there's too much government interference within private industry. More specifically, in some cases, it's because some of the interference is intrastate rather than interstate. You're going like, yeah, I don't care. You care a little, just a little. Okay. Trying to think what else I wanted to tell you. Oh, I think we'll stop sharing because I know it's starting to get a little late and we want to talk about the weekly question. So what happens after those two laws are declared unconstitutional is FDR gets mad, which did happen from time to time. And he gets really mad at the Supreme Court. And he's going to do something which is very much in the news now. He's going to create something called the Supreme Court Reform Plan. The nickname for that is court packing. Yes, court packing. So what he wants to do, he says that the Supreme Court is old and out of touch. Some of you go like, yeah, I saw a picture. Yeah, old and out of touch. And FDR was a little younger than the Supreme Court, not substantially, but they had, I think it was 5 or 6 justices over the age of 70. And life expectancy during that time period was still in the 60s. So, I mean, that's pretty old. That's pretty old for the era. So he said, these guys don't understand the modern era, so they shouldn't be adjudicating things that they don't understand. So we should put in a law, Supreme Court Reform Plan, that says they either have to resign at the age of 70, or for every justice who is 70 or older, I can appoint an extra justice. That would have given him the ability to add 6 new judges to the Supreme Court, hence court packing. And FDR is a excuse me, I just changed his party. FDR is a Democrat. And the people who opposed that program were primarily Democrats, the people who stood up against him in the Congress and said, like, sir, that's too much. His own party pushed back against him. So then he gave weekly speeches. They called them fireside chats. They were on the radio, so I don't know how you knew he was next to the fireplace. But some of them they did make newsreels of so you could see them. But he gave a weekly radio address, which is why we still, well, we don't now. We have that tradition up through Barack Obama, but President Trump, he tweets, so he doesn't need to do his weekly radio address. So he doesn't. It's like, I don't have time for that. So he doesn't. But up until Obama, we had a weekly radio address, which that tradition was started by FDR. So he gave his weekly fireside chat and he said, hey, I want to change the Supreme Court. The Congress opposes me. I would like for you to call or send letters or telegrams to the Congress and tell them what your opinion is on this. So the people did what FDR asked and overwhelmingly opposed the Supreme Court reform plan. And what one of the senators said was it was more power than a good man should want or a bad man should have, which is an interesting quote. Now, after this, the Supreme Court never declares any other part of the New Deal unconstitutional. So Dr. Foner and other historians will argue he got his intended effect without changing the Supreme Court, which is moderately interesting. Maybe. Maybe not. I don't know. That's up to you, isn't it? All right. So let's take a minute or two to talk about the weekly question. Weekly question. Okay. All right. Let me find the weekly question. Shouldn't be too hard, right? All right. So it's this one, number 4, which I don't know. My original document, I had 1, 2, 3, and 5. So apologies if that's the way it turned out on yours. Identify the changes in American politics and society brought about by the New Deal. Mention specific laws, philosophies, or politicians in this discussion. So when you're working on this one, I think I would talk about how Herbert Hoover was much more traditional in his acceptance of economic philosophy, that the economy would just fix itself, it's a business cycle, we're just in a down end, and will eventually recover without too much government interference. Now, he is willing to do RFC and Federal Farm Bureau and a few public works projects, most notably the Hoover Dam, but he really doesn't want to go beyond that because he thinks direct aid to the American public will make them dependent on government, that it's immoral, it'll make people lazy. FDR is more a follower of the Keynesian economic philosophy that the federal government has to intervene to end a depression. And then, of course, you definitely have to talk about what the New Deal was. That, in general, it's the idea that you're going to try all sorts of different things, and whatever works, you keep it. What doesn't work, you throw away. It's an analogy to a poker game where you play several hands, and if the hand is bad, you fold. If the hand is good, you keep, and then maybe, bet even more on it. You budget more money for it. It has 3 basic tenets: relief, recovery, and reform. And I would mention some New Deal agencies that are enacted. I think I'd probably mention the CCC just to cement it in your mind and make sure you're good for the quiz. You can mention AAA and NRA for that same reason if you like, but I would also mention some of the programs, and we'll talk more about them next time because I know we're a little short on time. But you can also mention some of the programs that really just created jobs. Some of like the WPA or the PWA that created the public works jobs. And, the idea there is the private sector isn't creating jobs. Somebody's got to. The only person with money if it's a person, the only entity with money is the government, so they can create jobs. And how the general philosophy of the United States at first is that what the government's supposed to do is stay out of your business, that the government's supposed to, protect the borders, but essentially stay out of business. By the end of this decade, people start to see one of the roles of the government as protecting the economy so that you have the freedom to earn a living. And Dr. Foner, who's, his theme that he carries through all of the book is, in the book called Give Me Liberty, is what is freedom to different people at different times. In this era, freedom is the ability to make a living, which needs to be protected by the government. So if conditions change to the point where you can't make your own money, then it's not only acceptable, it's almost required that the government step in to change those conditions. So to improve the economy so private business can succeed. And if they're unable to do that, to provide food or to create jobs individually, or, maybe even create programs that just give out money so that people will spend them. And the other thing the book does that I think is super interesting, and you could bring this up in your question if you have free time, which I know is hard to come up with, is that the government makes that society makes some of those programs seem more or less acceptable. Like if you're older and you get Social Security, that's an acceptable way to get money that, in that era you didn't put aside. I do recognize you pay into Social Security now. I also recognize that if you live a long time, you will get a lot more than you paid in. You will. It is true. But, there are other people, like my husband paid in for most of his life and then died young, so no one will get that money. And my mom did the same thing. My brother got some till he was 18. But, that program's designed to be that way, to, where the people like my husband and my mom, they offset the people like my dad, who will be 80 pretty soon and is probably taken out at this point more than he paid in. So good job, Dad. Bonus for you. But there are certain programs like food programs or especially programs for people in inner cities that people will start to kind of look down on. And they will say that those programs are really less acceptable and shameful. So I think that's pretty interesting stuff. I don't know. And that of course plays into discussions that we'll have later regarding lots of stuff. Civil rights movement in part, but also Great Society programs later on. Why are people poor? How do they become poor? Is it their own fault? Is it the government's obligation to help them not be poor? Do you really create your own opportunities in this world, or are some people just born with more opportunities? Is it the government's job to create fairness between people who are poor and people who aren't? I know, some big philosophical questions. All right, so I'm going to stop talking, which some of you are now going like, hallelujah. And also kind of double check to see if the people that I missed on the first round of roll taking are now here. Those people would include, I should probably stop recording. I'll do